This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to Israel and books and ideas and many other things. I'm your host, Dalia Shenlin.
And I'm Gilad Halpern.
This episode is brought to you by the Israel Democracy Institute, an independent center of research and action dedicated to strengthening the foundations of Israeli democracy.
Our guest today is Yuval Shany. He is the Vice President of the Israel Democracy Institute and a professor at the Faculty of Law at the Hebrew University, as well as a member of the UN Human Rights Committee. We'll be talking today about his research on the issue of state surveillance at a time of changing technology and metadata, specifically the question of how to balance security with privacy, and when does the state go too far. Professor Yuval Shany, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, nice being here. Thank you for having me.
So the ongoing tension between the right to privacy and state surveillance has become much more pronounced in the era of social media, where so much of the data is shared, often voluntarily, by ordinary folk. And not only that, it is readily accessible with the appropriate technology. It seems, though, that in America and the Western world at large, it has become a very hot topic, from the Edward Snowden affair in 2013 to the Cambridge Analytica scandal just a few months ago. In Israel, however, it didn't really stir any meaningful debate, and I wonder why that is. How do you account for this discrepancy? And do you think there could be an Israeli Snowden at some point?
Well, that's a very good question, but I think there are two separate principal answers to this. First, we did not have an Edward Snowden. So the United States also had for many years below the surface kind of regulatory scheme where there was a secret court, the FISA court, which monitor the powers of the various security agencies to track data. I mean, the assumption was that the data that is being tracked is non-American data, namely data that is affecting non-American citizens and is not collected on U.S. territory. But when the Snowden affair broke, it suddenly became apparent that this is not the case. And actually, the program is a program which allows the Secret Service, the NSA, to collect a lot of data about Americans, American citizens, and about American interests. And therefore, there was a call for a reform. So one reason that we did not have so far a revision of our schemes is that we didn't yet have a major scandal, which brings it to the awareness of the Israeli public what sort of information about them is available to state authorities. And of course, what's available to state authorities is also available to other actors, be them private actors who work for commercial gains, but also some nasty actors that are out there. Now, and secondly, it's also about privacy, and how much privacy is valued. And here you see a very stark difference between Europe and Israel, because Europe, they didn't have this major scandal like Snowden, but there is a very strong embedded support for the notions of privacy. And therefore, Europe gave to the world even, progressive rights in this field, such as the right to be forgotten. So the idea is that the data is yours. You control the data, and the companies or the governments really have very limited access because privacy is a very important human right. Our surveys in the Israel Democracy Institute show that actually privacy is undervalued in Israel, and that most Israelis would prefer, in terms of trade-off between security and privacy, to give up on their privacy and have security. And this may have, because of our roots as a community, the shtetl, the kibbutz, but it just seems that privacy so far hasn't had the same kind of attraction in Israel. And this is something really for a sociologist and not for a lawyer.
Right, I was going to say,
understand.
I would love to psychoanalyze this, but I'm not sure how complicated it is. We are a security-obsessed society, and we have a sort of ethos of collectivism here.
So that's interesting, because I think on issues as biometric data and the biometric cards, this actually gains some attention in Israel. So it's a little bit
some
about
opposition.
Some oppositions. So it's a little bit also about framing. I think a lot of the question is whether individuals in Israel have enough information of somewhat of a siege mentality. I mean, we are in a state of war, emergency for many years, and we trust our government government to protect us. And therefore, people are not so nervous about having their private information in the hands of the government because they think that the government means well and it will protect them from the outside. The problem is that, first, the government normally means well, but we have historical precedents that do show abuse of power. But more importantly, once the government has a database, that information sooner or later, the Office of Personnel Management, the OPM, it was hacked, it was leaked. There were thousands and thousands of records. It has the security clearance information of all public servants in the United States. And we don't know what has happened to it. It's probably in China at this point in time. So the thinking that we could just entrust governments to collect all the, and also, by the way, private companies to collect these mountains of data, and that this would not be used against us at a given point in time when the opportunity is really so easy and so accessible, I think this is very reckless.
Okay, I'd like to be the devil's advocate here for a second. Okay, so there's loads of information, of data that leaks. So what? I mean, what could happen? What is really the gravest consequences of that?
Well, I mean, if you want to live your life in a complete transparent manner so that everyone knows who you go to bed with and who are your friends and what are your political views and how much money you make and where do you buy your merchandise and what do you think to name your kids, etc., then there may be some people who don't have a problem with this. But I think for most people, this is a very uneasy way of life. And of course, everyone has vulnerabilities. And leading our lives thinking about the fact that all of these vulnerabilities are out in the open and that anyone that wants to use and abuse them at any moment can do that very easily, this is a very sad life. And in any event, look, this is we are not advocating, we people who work on human rights, we are not advocating privacy for privacy's sake. We are requesting that individuals have a choice and they will be able to make an informed choice about the level of privacy that they want to maintain. So if you, Gilad, you do not care about privacy, this is fine. I mean, you can be an exhibitionist. That's fine.
Go ahead, Gilad. Tell us everything.
But if I or Dalia want to take it more prudently, I think we have a right. This is the concept of having a right to privacy. Okay, so we have a right not to have this information about us shared with the whole world against our without our consent.
I want to make a comment on something you said earlier and then try to continue to sharpen this question. The comment you made earlier about the fact that for the most part, Israelis seem to trust that their government is using the information properly and therefore there's not such a protest against this. Shouldn't we specify that that's mainly the Jewish population because they don't feel the government has abused their privacy? But the Arab population may feel much more suspicious of being exposed to the government knowing.
No, that's exactly the case. I think many of us are much more nervous about the police having information about us than the Secret Service having information about us. And that has to do with the notion that the Secret Service is interested in information only in connection with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And as long as we are on the so-called right side of the conflict, then we have nothing to fear. When it comes to police, actually control of information, people are much more nervous, and actually the legal framework in Israel does have a more robust set of limits on police gathering of data and metadata than the Secret Service. And the reason may be exactly that, because the Jewish majority is nervous about the police having too much power, but is not as nervous about the Secret Service, the Israeli Security Authority, and other bodies of the same nature having this kind of information.
Okay, so what I want to try to do is make order out of exactly the same sort of the point that Gilad raised is like, what is actually the problem? In other words, all states have to balance security needs on some level, whether they have a conflict or not, with privacy. When does that cross a line? Can you define what the dangers are, where security turns into violations of privacy, and which bodies are involved? Is it worse that the private sector gets a hold of these things than the government? I mean, why do we assume one is worse than the other? Maybe it's just as bad if the government has access to everything. I'm just curious about these assumptions.
No. This is a big question. Where do you draw the line? It's very hard to draw the line in a very general sense.
Actually, I was just going to say, we're inviting you to answer as a legal scholar. I mean, what is really the legal provisions and the legal philosophy behind it?
As a lawyer working on human rights, I think you first want to see that there is a decision-making framework in place, which takes into consideration privacy interest. Okay, so the first question is whether we have in place a regulatory scheme We can disagree as whether exactly do you strike the balance. But the question is, do we have a scheme in place that factors in both security considerations and privacy considerations, directs the decision makers into striking a reasonable proportionate balance between them, and introduces a system of safeguards, which would typically be courts, or in other sensitive areas, it will be non-court commissioners and the like, in order to ascertain that these authorities have conducted a reasonable assumption. And then individuals who believe that they were wronged by the whole process would still have an ability to challenge, okay? The problem in Israel that we have very little of the first, very little of the second, and almost none of the third, which means that in terms of our framework is extremely loose. Namely, that there are areas that are loosely regulated, that are areas that are not regulated at all in ways which are meaningful and transparent. In terms of supervision, there are areas where you have real supervision, but there are areas, especially in security matters, where there is an extremely loose and not very independent supervision. And then with regard to remedies, it's almost non-existent. So we will never know whether we have been subject to surveillance. And if we never know because there is no duty of notification, such as we have, for instance, in some countries in Europe, where someone, after they have been subject to surveillance, are notified about this so they can bring a legal suit. Now, I realize that this is not a walk in the park. It has complications, but we do not have even the concept that we were wronged by the fact that information about us was stored in a certain place, even if it was not used or abused. So these are the elements. Of course, when we go into more specific issues, there are questions about bulk collection. Do we collect information with specific cases in mind in order to resolve a specific crime or to track specific individuals, or we're just collecting everything about everyone? This is, of course, an area where you have these discussions as to where to draw the line. There are questions about retention. Okay, so many states require companies, private companies that maintain data, for instance, telecommunication companies, to retain the data so that police or secret service can access the data. But then is the question, what is the length of retention period? Is it 6 months? Is it 2 years? Is it 15 years? And here is another area where you have different proportionality standards in place. And what sort of review are we? Is it political review? Is it judicial review? Is it a private commissioner? What sort of information? Do we have someone representing in these proceedings the privacy interest of the individual that is being surveyed? So these are all the nuts and bolts of what makes a surveillance regime proportionate or disproportionate.
But I would think that perhaps the comparison to other countries might be somewhat unfair, because a legal framework is meant to reflect somehow the political culture of the place. And as you said before, we Israelis are by and large more inclined to give up our privacy for the sake of security or whatever it is. Therefore, I mean, the so-called deficient legal framework that we have here in this area is just, an epiphenomenon of what we Israelis are like.
Look, I mean, we could have an argument with what should be the content of the legal framework here. I think what is unacceptable is that we have a framework that its two main pillars were constructed, one in 1979, and that is the
Sorry, I just want to clarify that I'm laughing and guffawing not because I think this is hilarious, but because I think these are serious issues. I'm struck by it.
Yeah. So we have a wiretapping law, which was passed in 1979 to regulate land phone line wiretapping. And then we have a privacy law from 1981. This is the regulatory framework. We have a more recent law, I should say, regarding to metadata, what we call communication data. And that is actually a modern piece of legislation.
Which is from 2006?
This is 2006 or 7.
Yeah.
So this is relatively recent.
What does it say? How far does it go relative to
So this is a reasonable... this, I should say, only applies with regard to police activity. So this is in relation to crime. It was interpreted by the court. There is a process of review. The court required that the data request would be specific. And I think this is actually how it should work. The problem is that this only applies to one part of the field. All the others are based on interpretations of the 1979 and the 1981 law, which deal with a world with a very different technology. So when you say the laws should be adapted to the needs of society, I'm fully on board. Let's adapt the old legislation to the modern needs of society. society. And it may be that the points of balance, in Israel should be different from in Germany, of the United States, or the UK, which, by the way, did pass very recently new legislation. And we are collaborating with them at the IDI to try to understand to what extent their very sophisticated institutional framework, investigative power, commissioners are actually also importable to Israel. Let's have a discussion and let's try to see what actually works for us and how to fine-tune it. But I think basically just giving the government the power to rely on old legislation and to do what it deemed fit when we have such a weak institutional supervision mechanism, it is really a very, very large opening which could be abused, and we don't know whether it has been abused or not, because everything which happens here is non-transparent. So this is not a very solid scheme. So I would say that I'm more concerned at this stage about the process of creating a framework than on the actual contents of the framework.
It's interesting. It reminds me of the debate over guns in America. People thinking about a constitutional amendment that was developed at a time when nobody imagined the kind of technology that exists today. And they have to deal with the same question about how to reinterpret it.
Yeah, and of course, states having armed militias. I mean, the political context was extremely
totally
different.
Yeah. I want to raise something that you mentioned just now, which I think is really key to this whole question, which is the question of how well we are even aware of what the regulations are. You've written that access to metadata is regulated, but the regulations are secret. And that gives us a situation where we don't always know. Even, I think I will just quote one of your articles where you write, it's unclear whether the Prime Minister himself exercised powers under the Basic Law to authorize the installation of a communications infrastructure which could include interception devices, but the provisions of the law for the exercise of the power is secret. Right. So how can we function when we don't even know what the laws are, never mind the transparency about what actually happened? And is that unusual to Israel?
This is quite... Look, when it comes to Secret Service and the regulation of Secret Service powers, it is indeed a very difficult terrain. And we do have an Israeli security agency law, which is relatively modern, from 16, 17 years ago, which in this area...
At least there was internet
So
then.
it's not 40 years old, it's only less than 20 years old, and it did authorize the Secret Service to access metadata, but this also applies to data. But you are right, that the basis of regulations is secret, so the administrative agencies have some power to issue. And in this regard, I think... it would, of course, be better had the regulations become public, or at least the gist of these regulations would become public so that we can have an informed debate on them. But the second best, we need some monitoring capacity, some independent monitoring capacity that would review both the regulations and the application of the regulations. Currently, we have monitoring, but this is an internal governmental monitoring, which is exercised by the Attorney General. And it is also exercised by the Knesset committee. From the informal information that we have, at least on the Knesset side, this is not a very robust form of review. It's done by the Knesset Secret Committee for Foreign Affairs and Security Matters. So in terms of public engagement with these powers, it is very loose. So I think having a stronger normative framework, having more transparency about the rules, and having stronger institutional safeguards, these would be very important reforms in the field without, of course, look, Israel is, I'm not belittling the security challenge. There is a security challenge, and it's important that the security agencies would not operate with both hands tied behind their back. And it's also true that, this is what my friends at the security agencies are telling me, it's true that in a world in which commercial entities have a lot of information, it does not make sense to bar governmental agencies from having any information. The problem is, of course, first, we should be unhappy also about the first part of the equation. Commercial entities having so much information is also not a healthy situation.
I think we're getting there.
And secondly, governments are, in a way, agents with a lot of power, and we know what the adage says about power and absolute power, etc.
Yeah. So there's a secret panel reviewing a secret panel reviewing secret regulation, more or less, right?
But it's all secret.
Yeah, it's all secret, so we're not allowed to say. Yeah, go on.
There have been incidents in the past regarding police apprehension of crime or suspected criminals that have come under fire for the police acting in a way that makes them seem like a military power, right? That they have been too strong-armed, too heavy-handed, and kind of going well beyond the protocol of normal police. Do you think that there is a danger of police drawing on tactics from the army precisely because of these kinds of things, that, there are regulations that are non-transparent in general in the Israeli security establishment, whether it's crime or conflict?
Well, generally speaking, this when police is engaged also in security security investigations and vice versa, yes, the line could be crossed. I think that the immediate concern in the Israeli context is that we give a lot of power to security agencies because we think what they're doing, which is mostly preventive security, is preventing attacks, is extremely important, and maybe there is no other way. The problem is that there are some states, such as Germany, in which there is a tradition of building a Chinese wall between preventive intelligence and then police work. And then everything that is being discovered in the course of prevention does not migrate directly to police work. And then this is a way they strike a balance between individual rights, individual liberties, and the need to protect security. Here in Israel, in this area and in other areas, there are no Chinese walls and there are not even separation fences. So we are, and again, we don't know exactly because a lot of the information is not transparent, but we have reason to believe that information can migrate from security service to police, which means that privacy violations have a dual effect. They also violate privacy, but they also complicate the legal status of individuals and maybe raises due process issues as well. But again, I'm somewhat reluctant to say anything definitive about this because we simply don't know what are the protocols for sharing intelligence information between the Israel security agencies and the police. We know that there are no rules prohibiting such sharing of information.
I want to go back to something that you said earlier in the beginning of this conversation about framing. When talked about briefly about the biometric database that perhaps we can go back to now, that did stir an opposition, actually quite a substantial public outcry. And I'm assuming, I'm not sure that you said it in so many words, but it has to do with the fact that it wasn't about security issues. It wasn't really about preventive security. It was more about the police than the security agencies. Does that give you...
It was issued by Misrad Apnim, by the Ministry of the Interior, and people do not associate the Ministry of the Interior with protecting their safety.
With national security,
they associate it with a big brother kind of entity.
So is the way forward to give all the authorities to the Interior Ministry so there would be a public outcry?
Or is there a weird way in which the Israeli society sees no danger anywhere unless it's from Palestinians or Arabs?
No, but in practical
but
matters...
actually the biometric cards had nothing to do with Palestinians.
That's what I'm saying.
And yet they created an outcry because it's true that security is really in many cases the win or lose, the make or break kind of factor. If people see this as a matter of security, they are willing to assume risks. But if people see that privacy issues have, of course, a strong security dimension, but they also have a lot of other issues. They relate to, to the equality. They relate to ability to exercise rights, their ability to job opportunities, their to political liberties. I think people will take a different look. And I don't think Israelis have a more limited understanding of what are rights and why rights are important in people around the world. So we may have some nuances, but it is difficult to understand why in the same issue is heavily regulated and increasingly being more heavily regulated around the world. And here we are in this oasis where there is no concerns about this issue. This month in Europe, the GDPR enters into force. This is the General Data Protection Regulation. So this is going to change dramatically the way in which private businesses are conducting their business in order to protect privacy. So this is the trend in which much of the developed world is going. And we are in that area, but also in the areas that we have been discussing, have been left very, very far behind.
But that give you some sort of motivations or inspirations? I mean, as to the practical tools that you as a scholar and a campaigner and, other people in your coalition could employ in order to make the situation in Israel slightly better?
Well, I think for us at the IDI, the first challenge is to simply produce as much information that actually analyzes what's happening in Israel and what's the comparative situation around the world. And this is the publication that we are now coming out with, where one of our researchers, Amir Kahana, under my supervision, has written a comprehensive review. And the next stage for us is again to understand in great detail the new mechanisms that have been established established in the UK, and because this is the most modern example, and of course there's also a lot of affinity. The United Kingdom is also very concerned about security issues. It's not a society which brushes off security concerns, and they do have the same debates about bulk collection versus specific collection, and about courts versus other entities. So I think this would be very useful to having in perspective. But more generally, it is to encourage thinking about privacy as a right that, yes, needs to be balanced against other important rights and interests. But this is something that we can hopefully raise attention to and get also the attention of decision makers. And we have been engaged already. We have had a conference on this last year with key decision makers. I think all the people around the table, from the Deputy Attorney General through other people from the security establishment, they did agree that we do have a problem in the sense that we do have laws that are badly out of date. And it's just a matter of there are so many other projects of updating legislation that they need to engage in that we need to somewhat push for prioritizing. So no one is actually disputing that the diagnosis that this is something that needs to be changed. It's just a question of how urgent is the change.
What about lawmakers? Is there anyone in the Knesset championing this cause? Anyone that you can talk to and work with?
No, so far our approach was to try to basically address the Ministry of Justice and the security establishment with an understanding that it would be very difficult to promote such a topic in Israel if it's not a government-sponsored bill.
How is the Minister of Justice on this issue?
So we have not communicated directly with the Minister of Justice, but we did communicate with the Attorney General and his staff, and as indicated, they were, without actually making any public statements on this, they seem to have been, at least from our point of view, they seem supportive of the agenda of updating the laws. I should say that the Ministry of Justice is working on updating the privacy law. And we do have a new privacy authority in Israel within the Ministry of Justice. So it's not as if the Ministry of Justice is ignorant of these concerns or indifferent to the importance. It's just that on this field, I think it's not probably the most urgent or the most immediate concern that they have. And it's true that Israel has many urgent concerns, but we think that this is a growingly important area, and I think we should be concerned about it.
And especially, I guess maybe it's not so urgent for the politicians because, as we noticed, the Israeli public isn't so up in arms about it mostly. But I want to end on a question which, after all, the Israel Democracy Institute is a think tank and an action tank. And you have written in some of your articles a number of very concrete suggestions for what you think should happen. Can you give us some of those ideas? Because it's clearly not that you're saying, well, this is not a zero-sum problem. So what are some of those suggestions that you have?
So concretely, I think there should be a process of updating legislation. This is a process. This is going to take some time. We think there needs to be appointed a privacy commissioner, which could be an extension of the existing privacy authority, but will be involved in cases in which data or metadata is requested, and it will represent in these cases the interest of the information holder. We think that the review process should be significantly strengthened, so we do have an independent commissioner that will review and approve decisions. Currently, it's just politicians or the Attorney General. In the UK, they now have a double lock system where it has to be a politician and an independent commissioner that reviews and authorizes such requests. And finally, we think that some sort of a duty of notification should be introduced so that persons who are subject to intervention, to surveillance, barring a security justification for not providing notification, the default should be notification. In the same way, some of us get sometimes when our luggage is opened in the airport and we do see it subsequently, we get a small note that you should know that this luggage has been subject to random check.
Maybe you do. I never had that.
Well, I get it sometimes, but maybe I'm more suspicious than you are.
Yeah.
I think so. Listen, people could see me, you would see the halo over me.
All right, Professor Yuval Shany, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and to Itai Shalem, our producer, and of course to the Israel Democracy Institute for the generous support. And now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we have a special request. Please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and press write a review, and then write one. Also, check out our archive. There are more than 400 interviews there to keep you busy, entertained, and hopefully annoyed. And if you like us there, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. And you are more than welcome to follow me and Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.